He dug through the frozen earth with his bare hands, blood mixing with coal dust. Beneath the floor of that forgotten cabin, the metal clinked again, like someone trapped still knocking for help. 15 years ago, they said the mine explosion was an accident, but the voices buried there never stopped calling. When Ethan Hawkewood found that hidden door, he thought he was uncovering a piece of history. He didn't know he was opening a grave. "They sealed us in," the old tape whispered. And from that moment, silence stopped feeling safe. Before we begin, support by subscribing. And tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? I truly want to see how far this story of truth and redemption can travel. The road had no name, only the rhythm of gravel beneath tired tires and the long sighs of wind curling through pine needles. The mountains were half asleep in fog, their silhouettes trembling like old men exhaling smoke into the cold. It was the kind of morning when the air tasted of rust and memory, too sharp to breathe, too heavy to ignore. Somewhere in that pale mist, a single cabin waited, small against the spine of the Appalachian Range, its chimney cracked like an old scar refusing to fade. Ethan Hawkewood turned off the engine and let silence rush in. For a moment it was absolute. No hum of metal, no echo of war, no ghosts calling from the past. Just the breath of the pines and the faint creak of settling wood. He sat still, his fingers resting on the steering wheel, feeling the rough leather beneath his calloused hands. The war had left him with many things. A limp that only showed when he was tired. A voice that never rose above quiet, and a need for silence that felt almost like hunger. He stepped out of the truck, boots sinking into frost-hardened mud. The morning light slid weakly through the trees, catching on old glass, broken shingles, and the withered porch that sagged like a man bowing to time. Hunter followed close, the 6-year-old German shepherd moving with the cautious grace of a creature that had seen too much yet trusted the world anyway. His fur shimmered brown and black in the cold, the steam from his breath hanging briefly before fading. The cabin was smaller than the photos had suggested, more ruin than refuge. The front door leaned crooked on its hinges and the windows were blind with dust. A single bird, crow or raven, it was hard to tell, watched them from a nearby branch, its feathers puffed against the cold. Ethan stared at the structure, then at the wilderness pressing close around it. He didn't need perfection. He needed somewhere the noise couldn't reach him. The real estate agent had called it a fixer-upper with history. History. He could feel it already, the way the ground seemed to hum faintly beneath his boots, the way the air smelled faintly of oil and old coal. There were stories here buried deep and waiting, but he had come to forget, not to dig. He walked the perimeter, each step crunching through brittle pine needles. When he reached the porch, Hunter stopped abruptly. The dog's ears lifted, his muscles tensed. "Easy," Ethan murmured, though his voice barely carried. Hunter's nose pressed to the ground, then froze. A sound rose from beneath the porch, a faint metallic clink, soft as a coin dropped on stone. Once, then again. Ethan crouched, brushed away a layer of damp moss and found a rusted plate half buried in the dirt. The letters were almost gone, eaten by rain and time, but one line still shone through the grime. Miller Mining Co. 1985. The year hit him like a small echo. 1985, long before he'd ever held a gun, long before the noise. Yet somehow it carried the same weight. He stood, rubbing the cold from his hands, his breath rising in uneven clouds. Hunter lingered near the edge of the porch, staring at the plate as if it might move again. The forest around them seemed to tighten. No birds now, no wind, only that stillness that comes before something is remembered. Inside, the air was thick with neglect. Dust motes drifted through the light that spilled from cracked boards. Each step he took groaned beneath his weight, the floorboards bowing like ribs under pressure. The faint smell of coal dust lingered, soot and iron, mixed with something older, something human. Grief, maybe. The kind that clings to walls when everyone else has gone. He found an old stove in one corner, a rusted lantern in another. On the mantel lay a single object, a nail bent into the shape of a cross. Ethan turned it over in his hand. Someone had made it by force, hammer against rage, steel against faith. He placed it back gently, as though disturbing it would wake the house. By late afternoon, he had unpacked the bare essentials: an old cot, a blanket, a small pot for coffee. Hunter had already chosen his spot by the fireplace, though there was no fire yet, only ashes left from years before. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. The mountains had their own scent: wet stone, pine sap, and stories too old for names. As twilight sank, Ethan sat on the steps of the porch. The sun dipped behind the ridgeline, bleeding the sky into amber and violet. He could almost hear the heartbeat of the land, slow, ancient, and steady. This was what he wanted. A place where the world stopped shouting, a place where he could remember how to breathe. But as the first stars pricked through the haze, Hunter's head snapped up. The dog growled low, the kind of sound that starts in the gut. Ethan followed his gaze toward the trees. Nothing moved. The silence grew heavier, pressing down until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The old wood creaked under his boots as he rose and went inside. That night, sleep came in fragments, like photographs fading in and out. He dreamt of sand and sirens, of men calling through smoke. When he woke, it was to the whisper of the mountain wind threading through the cabin walls. For a moment, he thought the sound was rain, but there was no rain. Only the long, low moan that seemed to rise from deep within the earth itself. Hunter's claws clicked softly on the floor as he moved toward the center of the room. His tail stiffened, ears pricked. Then came that sound again, a faint metallic note, muffled but deliberate. Tap, pause, tap, tap. Ethan held his breath. The dog lowered himself, nose pressed against the cracks in the floorboards. A soft growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan knelt, palm flat against the wood. The vibration was faint but real. Somewhere below, the earth was speaking, slow, patient, and old. He should have dismissed it, told himself it was just the pipes or maybe a shifting beam. But there were no pipes, no reason for anything to move down there. Only time. And time, he had learned, doesn't make noise unless it wants to be heard. He fetched the lantern, set it near the spot, and waited. The flame quivered, its light pooling across the cracks in the floor. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was not peace. It was listening. The mountain seemed to breathe with him, its exhale rattling the loose window pane. For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt something stir in his chest that wasn't fear or weariness. It was recognition. Like the place itself had been waiting for him, and now it knew he was there. He sat back, the old boards sighing beneath his weight. Hunter lay close, eyes fixed on the same patch of floor, ears twitching to some rhythm only he could hear. The air smelled faintly of smoke and coal, the same scent that had followed Ethan home from every battlefield. He closed his eyes, the lantern flickering beside him, and let the sounds of the mountain fill the empty spaces inside him. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping down the slopes and through the trees. It rattled the loose shutters, hummed through the chimney, and found its way into the cracks of the old house. To some, it might have sounded like weather. But to Ethan Hawkewood, it sounded almost like words, a whisper beneath the wood, soft but certain. Something was still here, something that remembered, and in that long Appalachian night, beneath a ceiling lined with dust and ghosts, The house breathed back. Morning came slow to the mountains, a pale light leaking through the mist like a secret that didn't want to be told. Frost clung to the truck windshield in thin white veins. The air was still, the kind of stillness that follows a question unanswered. Ethan Hawkewood started the engine, its rumble startling the quiet back to life. Hunter jumped into the passenger seat, pressing his nose to the fogged glass, watching the forest fade behind them as the truck rolled down the narrow dirt road toward the valley. The town appeared like a ghost materializing. Willow's Rest, a handful of old buildings strung along one cracked main street. The signs were faded, the windows blind with dust, the paint peeling from years of wind and indifference. A barber shop stood beside a hardware store that hadn't sold anything new in decades. Across from them, a gas pump from another century leaned tiredly beside the general store. It was the kind of town that looked like it had stopped keeping track of time the same year the mine exploded. When Ethan parked, the few people on the street turned to watch. A man in overalls paused mid-sweep. A woman carrying groceries slowed her step. They didn't speak, only watched. It wasn't hostility, it was recognition of something heavy, as though the town could already smell the dust of the past clinging to him. Ethan nodded once, a gesture returned by none. Inside the general store, the air was warmer but heavy with the scent of kerosene, coffee grounds, and thyme. Shelves leaned under jars of nails, tins of flour, and the dull glint of old tools. A small bell rang as he entered. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 60s, her posture straight despite the years, her hair pulled into a neat bun streaked with silver. Her name tag read, Clara Wexler. Her eyes, blue faded to gray, lifted when she heard his voice. "You bought the Miller cabin?" she asked, the words slipping out before she seemed to decide whether to say them. Her voice carried something between pity and warning. Ethan paused, surprised she already knew. "Word travels fast," she added quietly, as if apologizing for the town itself. "They say the mine took 32 souls, but only 29 were ever found." The register clicked softly as she punched the numbers, but her eyes never left him. There was something searching there, the way people look at a grave too long, half hoping to see movement. Ethan didn't answer. He had learned long ago that some silences said more than words ever could. He just nodded slightly, his face unreadable, his eyes somewhere else, perhaps still in a place where names were stitched onto uniforms and not tombstones. Clara's hands, thin but steady, wrapped the supplies, coffee, bread, kerosene, a box of nails. Her movements were deliberate, as if she had done this every day since the war, whichever war it was. As she worked, she spoke without looking up. "That cabin's been empty a long time. Folks don't last there. Not since—" She stopped herself, pressing her lips together, then forced a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful, Mr. Hawkewood. The mountain remembers." When Ethan reached for his wallet, she slipped something between the paper bags. A photograph, its edges soft with age. It was so quick, so quiet, he might have missed it if not for the look she gave him, a small, trembling kindness wrapped in fear. He didn't ask. He just nodded again and walked out, the bell above the door giving a lonely chime as it closed behind him. Back in the truck, Ethan unfolded the photo. A group of miners stood smiling before the mouth of a shaft, dust on their clothes, pride in their faces. They were ordinary men, the kind that disappear quietly while keeping the world standing. On the back, written in a woman's hand, Arthur Wexler, 1985, Clara's husband, one of the missing. Ethan stared at the handwriting until it blurred, the ink almost dissolving into the paper, and for a moment he could smell the mine, metal, smoke, and something that never stopped burning. Hunter rested his head on Ethan's lap, the weight of the dog grounding him in the present. He ran a hand over the coarse fur, then started the truck. The engine coughed to life, breaking the spell. As they drove back up the winding road, the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by fog as if it had never been there. By the time they reached the cabin, evening had begun to bruise the horizon. The pines bent in the wind like they were whispering to one another. The world seemed smaller somehow, as if the mountain had shifted closer while he was gone. Ethan unloaded the supplies in silence. The air inside the cabin felt thicker than before, like it had learned to breathe differently while he was away. He poured himself coffee, black and bitter, and sat on the porch steps. Hunter lay beside him, ears twitching at every sound. The rustle of branches, the distant cry of an unseen bird, the occasional crack of settling wood. The valley below was nothing but a shadowed sea, the last light sinking into its depths. Then came the wind again, low and long, threading through the cracks of the house, carrying with it the faint scent of coal dust. It sounded almost like the moan of something wounded but patient. Ethan stood listening. The mountain was alive in its own way, speaking through echoes and wood. When the first knock came, it was faint. 3 taps. A pause, then 2 more. It came from the floor again, same rhythm as before, same strange deliberation. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. Hunter's head snapped up. He growled, body tense, eyes fixed on the same patch of floorboards where the sound seemed to rise. His nails clicked sharply as he moved, pressing against the wood, ears flicking with every vibration. Ethan felt the hairs rise on his arms, not from fear, but from recognition. It wasn't random. It was pattern. He set his coffee aside, crouched down, and placed his palm flat on the floor. The wood was cold, the air underneath colder. He leaned closer, ear pressed to the seam between 2 planks. The wind outside howled, then hushed, as if the whole forest leaned in to listen. The knocking came again. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more, and then silence so deep it felt alive. Ethan stayed there, still as stone, the breath shallow in his chest. In that silence, he thought of the photograph, the faded smiles, the missing men. He wondered how many knocks it took before a soul gave up trying to be heard. Hunter whined softly, pressing his nose to the floor as though he could scent the memory beneath it. The lantern flickered, its flame bending toward the sound before standing straight again. Ethan whispered to himself, the words barely air. "What are you trying to tell me?" But there was no answer. Only the creak of old timber and the long sigh of the wind returning through the chimney. Somewhere, deep in the earth, the mountain exhaled. That night, neither man nor dog slept easily. The tapping didn't return, but the silence felt heavier, like something waiting just beneath the floorboards. Patient, deliberate, and aware. And when dawn finally broke, the light that poured through the cracks seemed older, as if it had traveled through years to reach them. The night had not yet surrendered to dawn when Ethan moved the lantern closer to the center of the floor. The boards glowed amber in the shifting light, their grain marked with decades of boots and secrets. Dust hovered in the air like fine ash, and each breath came with the weight of something old, remembering how to breathe. He didn't hesitate long. Curiosity, or maybe duty, had always been the same thing for men like him. With the crowbar wedged under the first plank, he leaned his shoulder and pried it free. The wood shrieked, brittle and unwilling. Cold air surged up from the gap, dense, stale, touched with the metallic tang of burnt oil and stone. It rolled across the cabin, making the lantern flicker and Hunter's fur bristle. The dog stepped forward, sniffed once, and let out a low whine that trembled between caution and recognition. The sound from below was not silence. It was the breath of the mountain, slow and waiting. Ethan crouched at the opening. The faint outline of a stairway spiraled into darkness, carved into the stone like a wound that had never healed. He whispered, more to himself than to the dog. So this is where you've been hiding. His voice fell into the void, swallowed instantly. Hunter went first. The shepherd's paws struck the steps in careful rhythm, claws tapping softly against damp stone. Then the sound stopped. No panting, no shifting, no breath. Just the dark holding its breath. Ethan felt the instinctive tug in his chest, the one drilled into soldiers long ago. You never let a partner vanish from sight. He descended slowly, one hand gripping the rough wall, the other holding a flashlight whose beam wavered like a living thing. The steps were slick, worn smooth by feet that hadn't walked them in decades. The smell grew stronger, oil, soot, and something faintly chemical. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a low passage. Its walls wept condensation, glistening in the dim light. Hunter reappeared from the shadows, tail stiff, eyes alert. His breath steamed in the cold, each exhale a small ghost vanishing into the air. They moved deeper. The tunnel curved, narrowing until Ethan had to turn his shoulders sideways to pass. The flashlight caught on something ahead, a stack of old coal sacks slumped against the wall, hardened to shape by time. He brushed them aside and froze. Behind them stood a steel door, tall and blackened at the edges as though touched by fire long ago. Letters were carved faintly into the metal. Miller Shaft, Access Tunnel C. Ethan ran a gloved hand across the words. The grooves were shallow but deliberate. It wasn't the door of a mine entrance. It was the door of a grave. He set down the lantern, braced both hands against the handle, and pulled. The hinges screamed, a sound so raw it felt human. Rust flaked off like ash, and the air that poured out was colder still, air that hadn't known sunlight in 40 years. Beyond the threshold stretched a corridor, narrow and uneven, lined with wooden beams blackened by smoke. The floor crunched under his boots. Gravel, glass, something else. Hunter led the way again, his paws echoing faintly. The sound traveled far before dying, as though the tunnel itself swallowed sound the way a confessional swallows guilt. At the end of the corridor, the beam of light struck metal, rows of filing cabinets, their surfaces eaten by rust but still standing in military order. Folders lay scattered, papers fused together by moisture, words fading to ghosts of ink. Ethan touched one drawer. It resisted, then gave way with a groan. Inside were sheets stamped with the company logo, Miller Mining Co. The dates were from the week before the explosion. Shift rosters, safety inspections, delivery reports, mundane things made sacred by the silence surrounding them. Then he saw it. In the back of the drawer, wrapped in the torn sleeve of a safety jacket, lay a small tape recorder, dull with grime. The label on its side had long faded, but the button still clicked beneath his thumb. The tape inside hissed before a voice emerged, a man's voice, trembling, roughened by dust and fear. "They sealed us in," it said, barely above a whisper. "Said it was a gas leak, but I saw the detonators. They buried us alive." The words broke off into static. Then nothing. Just the deep, aching nothing of time refusing to give back what it took. Ethan stood motionless, the sound replaying in his mind, each syllable heavy as stone. He looked at the jacket again, at the initials stitched faintly near the torn hem. A.W. Arthur Wexler. Clara's husband. He exhaled long and low. "God help you," he murmured. The dog stirred beside him, ears twitching. A drop of water fell from the ceiling and struck the floor with a hollow echo. Another followed, then another. Drip. Drip, each sound sharper than it should have been, as if amplified by the dark. Ethan turned the flashlight toward the corridor. The beam cut through the damp air, revealing nothing. Only the tunnel stretching back toward the cabin. Then, faint but certain, came the sound. Footsteps. Slow, steady, coming closer. He killed the flashlight instantly, plunging the chamber into darkness. The lantern's weak glow cast trembling shadows against the wall before he covered it with his hand. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the corridor, measured and deliberate. Hunter's growl rose from deep in his chest, low and warning, his body crouched, teeth bared. Ethan reached instinctively for his knife, the old reflex alive again. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Water dripped once more, distant, rhythmic, like a clock marking the end of something unseen. Ethan waited. Seconds or maybe minutes. In the dark, time had no meaning. Hunter inched forward, nose lifted, muscles tense. Then came a breath of air, cold, moving against the back of Ethan's neck. He turned fast, knife ready, but there was only emptiness. The shadows shifted as if something had moved beyond the edge of sight. He forced himself to breathe, to steady the pulse that hammered in his ears. The mountain wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by truth. And truth, he knew, always came walking slow. When he finally relit the lantern, the chamber looked unchanged. The papers lay scattered. The cabinets leaned tiredly, and the door still stood open, its edges bleeding rust. But the air was different now, charged, as though it had been disturbed by something that didn't belong to the present. Ethan picked up the recorder again, thumb brushing over its cracked plastic surface. The tape had ended, but the story hadn't. He glanced at Hunter, whose gaze stayed fixed on the tunnel. The dog's breathing was steady now, but his ears remained lifted, waiting. Ethan packed the recorder and the photograph into his jacket pocket. The evidence of what had happened here was fragile, but it was real. As he turned to climb the stairway back up, the wind from the opening above sighed down into the tunnel. A long, tired exhale, like the world itself remembering the names it once tried to forget. And for the briefest moment, Ethan thought he heard voices rising with it, 32 of them whispering beneath the drip of water. But when he stopped to listen, there was only silence again. The morning was gray and heavy, the kind of light that made everything look older than it was. Frost lingered on the porch rail, and the mountain mist pressed close like it wanted to listen. Ethan sat for a long time before deciding what to do. The tape recorder lay on the table beside his coffee mug, small and unassuming, yet it carried the weight of 32 buried voices. Hunter paced by the door, restless, as if sensing that what lay ahead wasn't a task of the hands but of the soul. The drive back to town felt longer than before. The road twisted between ridges veiled in fog, the forest dripping from last night's rain. Ethan's truck hummed low, the tires whispering on wet gravel. When he pulled into Willow's Rest, the same few faces looked up from their routines. Only this time there was no curiosity in their eyes, just quiet knowing. The kind of knowing that keeps a town small. The bell above Clara Wexler's door gave a single soft chime as he stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee and wood smoke, the same scent that seemed to follow all the places where grief lived too long. Clara stood behind the counter, her hair tied back neatly, her apron dusted with flour. When she saw the recorder in Ethan's hand, her lips parted, but no sound came out. He placed it gently on the counter and pressed play. The hiss filled the room, the tape's breath before it spoke. Then came the voice, Arthur's voice, rough, frightened, fading in and out like a signal struggling to reach the living. They sealed us in, said it was a gas leak, but I saw the detonators. They buried us alive. The sound wavered, cracked, and ended. Clara didn't cry. She just closed her eyes, her hands resting flat on the counter. For a moment, she looked years younger, as though memory had replaced time. Her lips trembled when she finally whispered, "I knew he didn't run." The silence afterward felt sacred. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to pause between ticks. When she spoke again, her voice was low but steady, like someone peeling away the last layer of fear. After the explosion, they gave us money, called it compensation. She paused, her eyes meeting Ethan's. It wasn't payment. It was silence. Ethan didn't interrupt. He had learned that truth, when finally spoken, deserved to breathe. Clara's fingers traced the edge of the counter as she continued. The sheriff called it an accident. Said the gas lines were faulty, but those men, those boys, they knew better. The mine was being used for chemical storage, illegally. The kind that eats through skin if you spill it. Victor Lowell owned half of it then. He owns half the county now. Her mouth twisted into something caught between grief and disgust. You don't stay rich in a place like this unless you know how to bury things. Outside, a truck passed, the sound rolling like distant thunder. Clara flinched but didn't stop talking. People around. Here, don't mention it anymore. Not out of respect, out of fear. When Ethan left, she didn't follow him to the door. She stood there, still as a figure in a photograph, one hand resting on the recorder as though it were a relic from a forgotten church. The drive back to the cabin felt colder. Clouds pressed low, bruising the sky into the color of old steel. Hunter sat upright now, watching the road behind them through the rear window. Ethan checked the mirror once, then again. A black SUV had appeared at the curve, too far to make out the driver but close enough to stay in sight all the way up the mountain road. By the time he reached the cabin, evening had begun to bleed into the trees. The SUV was gone, or maybe it had never been there at all. But the sense of being watched hung in the air, thick and metallic. The front door was ajar, just slightly. Enough to know someone had been there. Hunter pushed past him first, nose low, shoulders stiff. Inside, the place looked ransacked in a quiet, deliberate way. The table overturned. The floorboards near the lantern pried open, the same ones he had uncovered days ago. The tape recorder was gone. Not stolen for money, but for silence. Whoever had come knew exactly what they were looking for. On the windowsill lay the smallest of clues. Cigarette ash still warm, a thin spiral of smoke curling in the fading light. And near the torn boards, a footprint pressed deep into the coal dust. Fresh. Size 11 heavy tread, the kind worn by men who worked security, not labor. Ethan stood there for a long while, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and intrusion. Hunter paced again, growling low, eyes fixed on the doorway. Somewhere in the forest, a crow called once, sharp and distant before falling silent. He sat on the porch as night descended, his rifle across his knees, Hunter curled beside him. The cold crept in, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, but not from his chimney. It came from farther up the ridge where the mine once breathed its last. A dull orange glow flickered against the horizon, licking through the trees like a slow-moving wound. Someone had set a fire. The mountain was burning. The flames were faint but steady, the kind meant not to warm but to erase. Ethan watched in silence, his jaw tight, the reflection of the fire dancing in his eyes. He knew this kind of act. The military had another word for it, containment. He whispered almost to the wind, "Whoever buried them isn't done." Hunter lifted his head, ears twitching toward the distance, a low whine catching in his throat. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back, steadying him. The warmth of the animal's heartbeat was the only living rhythm in that moment, proof that something still endured. Somewhere far off, a car engine roared to life. The sound rolled down the valley, bounced between the trees, and vanished. Then came the stillness again, deeper than before. Ethan stayed there until the glow faded to embers. The air filled with ash so fine it looked like falling snow. The mountain had been silent for 40 years, but tonight it spoke again. Not in words, but in fire. And in that silence between the crackle and the wind, Ethan understood what kind of story he had stepped into. This wasn't about ghosts. It was about debts that the living still owed to the dead. The morning came with sirens, not the fast kind that begged for rescue, but the long, hollow cry of inevitability, the kind that sounded when help was already too late. From the ridge above Willow's Rest, Ethan could see the smoke rising in a thin black column against the pale sky. The wind carried the scent of burning pine and something else, something acrid, chemical, wrong. Clara Wexler's house was gone. By the time he reached what was left, the fire trucks had already pulled away, leaving behind the smell of soaked ash and silence. The frame of the house sagged inward like a tired heart. The front porch had collapsed into a pool of blackened water, still hissing in spots where the embers hadn't yet surrendered. A deputy scribbled notes by his cruiser. His tone was practiced, his grief mechanical. "Faulty wiring," he said, but the power lines here hadn't worked for years. Ethan didn't argue. He just stood at the edge of the property, his hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the steam rise. Beside him, Hunter sniffed the scorched earth, moving slow, deliberate, until he froze. The dog's nose hovered over a patch of gravel, tail stiff, ears flat. Ethan knelt and saw it, a faint sheen on the ground catching the gray light. He touched it with his glove and knew the smell instantly. Gasoline. Hunter moved ahead, following the invisible trail through mud and frost, leading away from the ruins and down toward the valley. Ethan followed, boots sinking into half-frozen soil, his breath a slow fog before him. The forest seemed quieter than usual. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of steps and the pulse of purpose. The tracks led them to the edge of the old mining road. Rain from the night before had turned the earth to paste, yet the tire marks were still clean, fresh, cutting deep. Ethan touched one, tracing the tread with his fingers, heavy vehicles, at least two of them. He looked toward the ridge and saw smoke again, faint but steady, seeping upward from the direction of the mine. They climbed in silence, the mountain groaning beneath their weight. The air thickened with the scent of ash and iron, and somewhere below, the echo of dripping water whispered like a slow heartbeat. At the base of the hill, they found what was once the main entrance, now a pile of rock and timber collapsed decades ago. But the smoke told a different story. Between the stones, faint wisps curled like the breath of something still alive. Hunter growled, pacing at the edge of the rubble, pawing at the dirt until one stone shifted loose. The movement released a gust of air so cold it stung their faces. Air that carried the sour bite of oil and decay. Ethan pulled the crowbar from his pack, wedged it beneath a slab, and pushed. The stones gave way with a low moan, revealing a narrow crawl space descending into the dark. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the dust, illuminating the rough walls streaked with soot. The passage was cramped, every surface slick with condensation. Hunter went first again, his body moving with instinctive caution, claws scraping gently against the floor. Ethan followed on hands and knees, the air growing heavier, each breath tasting of rust and chemical rot. The tunnel widened suddenly, opening into a chamber so still it seemed untouched by time. The light caught on metal shapes, rows of chemical drums stacked against the far wall, their labels half peeled but still legible. Lowell Energy, 1985. Some were dented, some leaking, a slow ooze of viscous fluid pooling beneath them. The air shimmered faintly, toxic in the light. In the center of the chamber stood what remained of a makeshift shelter. Planks, canvas, and a rusted cot collapsed inward. And chained to one of the support beams, half buried beneath years of dust and soot, were bones. Human. The chains still looped around the wrists, fused with the metal by rust. Ethan froze. Hunter whimpered, head bowed low, pressing close to his leg as though the weight of it all demanded reverence. Ethan knelt beside the remains. The beam beside them bore marks, faint at first, then clearer as he brushed away the grime. Letters carved deep by a miner's knife, We're still here." The words lingered in the air like breath that refused to fade. He didn't speak. He just reached out, laid a gloved hand on the beam and bowed his head. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of names, of voices, of everything that should have been heard. Then came the sound. Tires on gravel, engines idling just beyond the entrance, headlights spilled across the stone, slicing through the dust. The beam of light trembled over the bones, over Ethan's hands. The black SUV. Voices echoed faintly. 2, maybe 3 men speaking in low, curt tones. The same men who had taken the tape, the same who had burned the past once already. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the recorder. The red light blinked weakly, the battery nearly dead. He pressed record anyway, his voice a whisper swallowed by the cave. "If you're hearing this," he said, "the mine wasn't an accident." The first bullet struck the rock near his shoulder, sparks bursting like brief daylight. The echo thundered through the chamber, trapped and multiplied by stone. Hunter lunged toward the tunnel, barking, the sound feral and alive. Another shot, this one closer. Ethan rolled behind a drum, returning fire. The flash of his gun lit the chamber in strobing bursts. Walls, barrels, bones, shadows colliding like memories. One of the men shouted, his voice swallowed by the roar of ricochet. Hunter leapt, catching movement before it reached Ethan. The sound of teeth, a cry, the thud of bodies on stone, the tunnel filled with smoke and gunpowder, the air trembling with the violence of it. Ethan fired again, once, twice. The last shot cracked through the noise like an ending. Then silence. He stayed crouched, the gun steady in his hands, listening. The echo faded, leaving only the dripping of water somewhere deep within the cave. Hunter limped back toward him, a dark streak on his fur, but eyes alert, alive. Ethan reached for him, pressed a hand against his shoulder, gratitude without words. The recorder's red light still blinked faintly on the ground, catching the reflection of the lantern flame. He picked it up, his thumb brushing over the button that had captured it all. The truth, the confession, the proof. From deep within the tunnel came a sound, a low rhythmic rumble. At first he thought it was thunder. Then he realized it was the mountain itself breathing. The air pulsed, drawing in and exhaling through the cracks of the stone. The mine wasn't dead. It was remembering. Ethan looked around one last time, at the words carved into the beam, at the remains chained there, at the poison barrels still leaking into the earth. He knew now what had to be done. But for that moment he simply stood still, letting the mountain exhale around him, like it was finally freeing the ghosts it had been forced to keep. The mountain was quiet when dawn came, a pale wash of silver sliding down through the pines. The fire had burned itself out sometime during the night, leaving behind a soft veil of smoke that curled like ghosts reluctant to leave. The first sound that broke the silence wasn't birdsong, it was sirens. Slow at first, distant, rising through the valley until they reached the ridge road. The echo rolled through the trees like an old hymn. By the time the first responders arrived, the air was thick with ash and mist. Reporters followed, their vans crawling up the narrow road like scavengers drawn to light. A black helicopter swept overhead, the downdraft bending the treetops, scattering soot into the dawn. FBI agents stepped from their vehicles, their jackets marked with bright yellow letters that looked almost obscene against the gray ruin. They moved with the cold efficiency of people who had seen too much and believed too little. In the chaos, someone shouted for silence. A voice called out, "We found the recorder." They lifted it from the mud near the mouth of the mine, the casing cracked, half buried in soot. But the red light still blinked. Faint, insistent, alive. They played it right there in the cold morning light while cameras clicked and the mountain listened. Ethan's voice filled the air, rough but steady. If you're hearing this, the mine wasn't an accident. It was followed by the roar of gunfire, the echo of the fight underground. The recording ended in a silence so absolute that even the wind stopped to hear it. Victor Lowell was arrested before noon. The evidence found in the tunnels, the chemical drums, the documents sealed in rusted drawers, the bones still chained beneath the beams, was enough to turn the whole county inside out. Agents marked the area with bright tape, the words "federal crime scene" flapping in the wind like yellow ribbons for the dead. From across the valley, the townspeople gathered, silent, watchful, standing shoulder to shoulder at the edge of their history. Among them was Clara Wexler. Her face was streaked with soot, her coat draped loosely around her small frame. She stood beside the ruins of her home, the fire long gone but her eyes still reflecting its light. When they told her that her husband's name would be cleared, she didn't collapse, didn't cry. She just smiled, a thin, trembling smile that carried both gratitude and grief. "Arthur didn't run," she said quietly. "He stayed." The wind picked up, lifting the ashes into the air. They rose like snow, catching the morning light, swirling around her like something sacred. And for the first time in decades, the name Wexler was spoken in town without fear. Weeks passed. The mountain healed the way old wounds do. Slowly, unevenly, but with purpose. The snow came and covered the scars, and the forest began to reclaim the burned edges of earth. The mine was sealed for good this time, not out of greed, but out of respect. A memorial was built near the entrance, 32 names engraved on a bronze plate. People left flowers there, and sometimes when the wind passed through, it sounded almost like distant knocking. Ethan rebuilt the cabin door himself. The boards were new, the hinges clean, but the wood carried the same old silence. When he finished, he leaned the hammer against the wall and stepped back. The light through the window fell across the floor where the secret once began. It looked different now, open, unburdened. Hunter lay by the porch steps, eyes half closed, his fur catching the afternoon sun. He had healed from the gunfire, though a faint scar traced his shoulder like a medal the earth had given him. Ethan sat beside him, one hand resting on the dog's head, the other holding a cup of coffee gone cold. The mountain was quiet again, but not empty. The wind whispered through the trees, soft and forgiving, no longer a moan, but a song. The metallic knocking beneath the floorboards had ceased, as if the mountain too had finally exhaled. Ethan watched the horizon fade into gold and gray, the world wrapped in a kind of stillness that felt earned. The silence no longer punished him. It kept him company. It wasn't the silence of war or loss or guilt. It was the silence of things finally understood. Sometimes he would speak aloud, to no one in particular. Maybe to the mountain, maybe to the dead. Just a few words carried off by the wind. "I heard you." As twilight bled into night, the last light of Willow's Rest flickered through the trees. Not fire, not destruction, but peace. The town would go on, smaller perhaps, quieter but lighter. And those who had been lost were no longer hidden beneath stone and lies. They had names again, voices again, because one man had listened. And in the final voiceover, soft as dusk settling on old wood, "Sometimes," it says, "the dead don't want vengeance. They just want someone to listen." The screen fades to black. The sound of wind carries one last note, not mourning, but mercy. There are stories that never make the papers, stories that live only in the quiet corners of small towns, in the wind through an old mine, or the echo of a name spoken after too many years of silence. Ethan's fight wasn't for glory. It was for the truth, and for the ones who never got to speak it. And maybe that's what courage really is. Not the noise of battle, but the stillness that follows when someone chooses to stand their ground even when no one's watching. The world forgets fast. But every once in a while, someone like him reminds us that loyalty still has a heartbeat, that kindness can survive the fire, and that there are men, quiet, steady men, who keep watch when the rest of us sleep. So if this story stays with you tonight, let it remind you of those unseen souls, the ones who gave more than we'll ever know, and asked for nothing in return. Because peace isn't built by heroes who shout. It's kept by the ones who whisper. This has been another story from Lone Veteran Stories, where the forgotten find their voice and the brave are never truly gone.